Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our regular lunchtime series of Posturite Webinars. I'm John Ridd, and I'm taking the anchor role for today's talk. And today we're lucky to have with us Tom Stewart, who is a world-renowned ergonomist who founded the company, and some of you may have worked with him, the company System Concepts. I think it was back in the early 80s, in fact. I've known Tom for a long time, and Tom is an old friend, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, Tom. And he's served ergonomics both as a consultant with his business, but also in a number of formal ways for the institute. Who I think he's served 2 terms as president of the Ergonomics Institute. And more relevant to today's presentation, perhaps, is his chairmanship of over the years of a number of different national, European, and indeed international ergonomics committees. And some of what he's going to talk to us today about is one of those issues, which is ISO 27500, and that has been through some turbulent international political waters, but the compromise has eventually come through, and he helped to bring this to publication last year. Now, the issues that this standard deals with are something that touch, I think, everybody's lives, and it's only becoming more and more relevant to us, I think, as every year passes. Now, before I let Tom get underway, there is just the usual thing I need to point out to you all, that you have an opportunity to put questions to Tom. If you wish to, in that panel on the right, there's a questions box, and if you type your questions in, then I will endeavour to put these to Tom at the end of his presentation, if we have time. So, thank you all for tuning in. Let me now hand over to Tom for his presentation, which I believe is entitled How to Take a Human-Centered Approach to Business. So, Tom, over to you.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, everybody, for listening. As is usual, my title on the slide is very slightly different. These slides have slightly more text and information on them than I'm going to talk about. The idea is that they'll form a bit of a aide-memoire notes if you're interested in afterwards. But what I want to do, as John mentioned, this standard, which I believe is extremely important, the Human-Centered Organization, published last year, I want to explain where it comes from, the background, what it's about, some key elements of the content, and then what I think it means for people, particularly those involved in health and safety. So if we start, make sure I've got my mouse in the right place. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to split screen here. Just a bit of background. British Standards, it's the national standards body in the UK, been there a long time. But in fact, for ergonomics areas, the work is largely done in Europe and internationally, and the 2 committees, the committee in the UK that mirrors those international committees it's got the catchy title of PH9 Applied Ergonomics, and I chair that committee, and there's an ISO and a SEN committee that it mirrors. I've been involved in ergonomic standards since 1983, when this was a fairly typical office workplace. Fixed keyboards and screens positioned in a nice window where you couldn't put blinds, and you got sun in your face in the morning or the sun on your screen in the afternoon. But it was in Ipswich, so you don't get a lot of sun there. But this is the environment where we felt the need to create some ergonomic standards to improve the world. And that standard series is now the ISO 9241 series on the ergonomics of human system interaction. It addresses a whole range of initially hardware, furniture, environmental, and software issues. It's been under development for a very long time. It's still being developed. Parts are still being added. There's lots of parts there. But one of the problems we found was that we were playing catch up with the technology. The technology was moving much quicker than we could. And so in 1999, we published a standard about the human-centered design process, which was kind of technology-free. Basically, it said if you understand who you're designing for, you take up account of the best knowledge and best practice ergonomics and other information and create a design, and then you test it with your users, you can create much better ergonomically sound products, systems, and services. And that standard was initially purely recommendations, shoulds in ISO speak, but it was very widely well received and very widely used. And so in 2010, we published a revised version, which again in ISO speak had requirements, shalls. So it was very similar in content, but it allowed you then to say we follow a human-centered design process. Now, as John mentioned, the founders of System Concepts, I've actually retired now, although I still retain an interest. And System Concepts version of the human-centered design process looks like this, that you start by researching the requirements of the users, tasks, environments, and processes, and so on. Then you create design solutions using best practice standards and knowledge, and then you evaluate them using mock-ups, prototypes, etc., with real users. And of course, you take that data, feed it back into your design, and you keep going around that loop until you're happy to release your product to the world. Sometimes one iteration is enough. Sometimes for a very critical product, you go around it several times. But the point is that you know what you're doing. You know how well you're meeting your customers' requirements before you release the product in the market. And one thing that I've been very pleased about is that that standard's been widely accepted by people like the UXPA, User Experience Professional Association, widely used by mobile phone and web industry, but it's also been adopted as a core process within the MOD's latest revision of the human factors integration standards for procurement. So a very wide application, and I mean it's sort of just common sense, except of course common sense isn't common and people don't do it. So having a framework has proved very helpful. And we got to thinking, well, hang on a minute, we actually know quite a lot about how organizations should behave from this process of design. Why don't we try and apply that process to the organization as a whole? And so last year we published, this is ISO, the Human-Centered Organization General Principles. And it's effectively a hearts and mind standard. It's not got a lot of detailed requirements or contents. It's meant to capture corporate board's attention to say, hang on a minute, that's a good thing, we should try and do that. And then some poor soul lower down will be given the task of actually implementing it. It's 7 top-level principles. And one of the things we were concerned about when people would say, well, it's all very idealistic, you ergonomics-y type people, you're not in the real world, it's not business-focused. And we said, not at all, we know these things are good for business. And for every principle, we searched the web and found examples of companies that claimed to already be doing these things on their website. Now, of course, claiming to do it on the website and doing it is not the point. The point is that these people have said that these are things they believe in, and who am I to question whether they actually do it or not? There is some guidance on implementation in the standard, but the committees are working on further guidance to support the standard in the future. So let's look at these principles. First of all is that people vary. People are individuals. And the first principle here is to actually capitalize on that. Don't see it as a weakness, see it as an organizational strength. Of course, that means you need to understand the differences, you need to use data on the range of people, you need to apply ergonomics techniques to cope with that wide range of individuals. But if you do that, then we believe, and indeed this large diverse multinational, we weren't allowed to name them. ISO lawyers were frightened, not that the people we named would have a problem, but the people we didn't name would have a problem, so they're not allowed to name them. Large diverse multinational, talk about diversity and performance go together. If I was a mischievous soul, I would say cut and paste the quote and Google it and see what you find. Make usability and accessibility strategic business objectives. There are, as I mentioned earlier, human-centered design process standards that are widely available and widely used. Really make them part of your corporate strategy. Don't design systems and then be surprised when they don't work and then have to do remedial work. Design from the beginning. And the quote here is from a major broadcast company, and not NBC. If you change the M for another letter, you'll be very close. Committed to ensuring that digital services are as accessible to disabled and elderly people as reasonably possible. In fact, in System Concepts, we did a lot of work with this company when they first introduced something called the iPlayer. Their original concept for it was the wrong way around. They almost had the player on the in the website, and the computer was the host, and they were it was very computer-oriented language. So we helped them. Originally, we were actually working with on an accessibility front, but it turned out that the users with disabilities had all the same problems that the more able users would have. So they were able to improve the usability of the system as well. Adopt a total systems approach. Systems are complex things. They're a mixture of people, equipment, workplaces, physical environments, organizational environments, procedures, and so on. And following a socio-technical approach to the design and implementation of new systems is fundamental to getting the best out of the people and indeed getting the best out of the technology. Too much technology fails because it's failed to understand what people actually do. The quote here is from an international car manufacturer who I believe only yesterday has invested another couple of $100 million in the UK, and their production system, in their own words, is an integrated socio-technical system. Safety people, but ensure health, safety, and well-being are business priorities. Clearly, around the world, there are legal requirements to do a lot of stuff in safety. There's a kind of consensus in the health and safety world that we've sort of done safety. That's not quite true, but very few people would now argue about the importance of safety. Lots of companies do lots of things. Health is a bit further behind, and well-being is even further behind. But there have been initiatives that the latest HSE strategy talks about this. The government's talked about it a lot as well. Is promoting well-being as good wealth, good health, good well-being is good for business, good for the UK. Proactive, not just minimal, you can get away with. Large manufacturing company there that we quoted from. Create a meaningful work environment. The literature is full of examples where employees were not valued, where the work environment is not meaningful. And in fact, in today's gig economy, I'm somewhat horrified at the quotes you hear about the leaders of companies like Uber, who seem to have an extraordinary worldview and treat people not only as components, but as fairly contemptible components, whether they're employees or customers. We know that's not the best way to get things out of people. It's not good for the people. It's actually not good for a customer-facing business. If you treat your people like rubbish, it's extremely hard to expect that they're going to treat your customers any better. And with internet and digital businesses, your competitors are a click away. Major internet company, they're pointing about the importance of team achievements and pride in individual accomplishments. It seems sort of obvious, but one of the problems is, particularly these days, there's a lot of difficult decisions that need to be made in businesses, and you see it not only in private business, but you see it in the public sector as well, where people would like to be open, but they're frightened because they don't really understand fully the implications of what's happening, and it's nasty, it's not going to be pleasant, and they often kind of shy away from it and try and be secretive. We know from a lot of experience that that's exactly the wrong way to deal with difficult situations. The right way to do it is to be as open as possible, to admit where you can't be certain, and to follow as transparent and trustworthy a process as possible. This electronics company regards sound and transparent management practices as the foundation to achieving individual success and global competitiveness. And then the final, act in socially responsible ways. Now, this isn't one that we've made up. This is there's already an ISO standard 26000 social responsibility. But what we do here is flag it up and say, following ISO 26000, you're behaving ethically, you're instilling pride and confidence in your employees, customers, and the local community. And increasingly, companies are not only concerned about their own footprint in this way, but they're also concerned about making sure that their suppliers meet such requirements. So even a company that may by itself not naturally feel very inclined to be socially responsible is getting the message that if they're not seen to be responsible, then their big customers may actually go elsewhere. big company here, big manufacturing company, talking about the founder's conviction that in a free enterprise, the community is not just another stakeholder, but is in fact the very purpose of its existence. So that's the 7 principles, all fairly straightforward, all the kind of things that we hope senior members of boards will look at and say, yeah, we should be doing all of that kind of stuff. So how do you take it forward, particularly if you're involved in health and safety, which I gather a number of you might well be? Well, the next steps that I think is you are the people who can take the lead in implementing BS ISO 27500. The BS ISO means that it's an ISO standard that's been adopted by British standards. It's the same standard, but the standards people like to use confusing names to make life difficult. It's the same standard. But as is obvious, what I've said so far, the 7 principles go way beyond what people would normally regard as just ergonomics. They reach into all aspects of the organization, and there is no real natural home for them. There's lots of places where they could be. It could be HR, it could be other things, but in my view, HR isn't always seen as being that proactive. They seem to be a more a sort of reactive type of organization. If this was an audience where I could see your faces, I might make a joke about HR, but given that some of you out there might be in HR and I can't see your faces, I won't do that. But as I say, not necessarily the right place to be dealing with the human-centered organization. Sorry, let me just... So the first thing you should do, and this is something that I think you can do, no matter what your level in the organization, you may not be able to do it alone, but I think no matter where your niche is, conduct a gap analysis. Most organizations already do some of these things. You may even do all of these things. What I'm fairly confident about is not only do you not necessarily do them all consistently in all your locations all around the world if you're international or across the UK, but I'm sure you also don't all know that you do them. It's surprising that one of the nice joys as a consultant is going into companies and finding out that the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand, and that you're sometimes the one who's actually making those communications between different parts of the organization. So conduct a gap analysis, find out what you already do, find out what's already working, what's going well, what could be extended, how far away are you from being fully there. Seek a board level champion. Unless you are on the board yourself, you need someone to engage someone who can say, yes, I believe in this, we should be doing that, we want to be seen to be that kind of organization. Now, although we kept the standard brief and in fairly chatty English, it's still a standard, so we're constrained about what it can be. So what we've done is the introduction, which is freely available from both the ISO and BSI website. It has been written to be an executive summary. The 7 principles are listed there. It's more or less 1 page. And to be honest, for many senior people, that's, excuse me, that's probably as much as they need to have. You obviously need to buy the standard and have the detail, but for them, that's sufficient to get that board level champion on board. And then plan this proactive health, well-being and safety initiatives and risk assessment programs. It's an opportunity to look again at lots of the things the organization does, try and make them better. One of the things I've been quite sad about over the years is that the old sort of O&M departments that used to poke about and find ways of improving business kind of became subsumed by people like business process re-engineering, etc., which were often just euphemisms for sacking people. And actually, there's very few people now in the business who can stand back and look at what they're doing and say, now, is this the right thing we should be doing? Is it using our people properly? Are we getting the most out of our people? Are we getting the most out of our technology? So a proactive health, well-being and safety initiative and risk assessment program can actually be a framework for doing that, which resonates well with business. It's not an aside, but its key point is to ensure that reward systems do not inadvertently encourage or reward unsafe or unhelpful behavior. One of my observations over several decades of consultancy is that managers in the middle are often being squeezed by both sides. They're being complained about from underneath for being too oppressive and not giving people flexibility, and they're being complained about from above by not giving people enough flexibility and freedom but still having to meet targets. So actually sometimes the reward systems and the management systems actually encourage exactly the wrong kind of behavior. I remember we did a big project for the Brewers Society on manual handling in the brewing industry, trying to encourage safe practice. And I remember one person talking about their kind of company magazine had reported on this drayman successfully delivering a client's beer by manhandling it over a 6-foot fence, which because the gate was closed and the guy needed the beer for Christmas, and they were saying, wasn't this fantastic customer service? Well, yes, except it was completely against all the health and safety rules and extremely dangerous. So again, make sure these systems don't encourage or reward unsafe behavior. And then finally, of course, inevitably, there needs to be training. Staff and managers, make them aware of responsibilities. You already have training programs doing a lot of these things, but it needs to be refreshed with the concept of being human-centered. And we've already seen in a couple of organizations that's been quite a good hook to invigorate the organization, to get them to think, yes, we do pretty well. Are we doing as well as we can be? What lessons can we learn from ourselves, from our other parts of the world, and put them into action? That the launch seminar for this conference, this standard, we had a speaker from I've just forgotten what they're called now. They make Jaguar Land Rover, that's who they are. And she was talking about their moves towards doing these, being more human-centered. She reckoned they already did quite a lot of those things. But what was interesting was that they have factories all over the world in places like China and India and the UK, etc., where the cultures are very different. And she was absolutely sure that although they try and create the same organizational systems and processes everywhere, they were almost certainly not all singing from the same hymn sheet, as you say, all the time. So it's a good opportunity to get out there and shake the trees. So finally, thank you for listening. If you want to get involved in the work of ergonomics standards, particularly the applied ergonomics through the UK or internationally, then Sarah Chain at BSI Group is the secretary, and Tom Stewart me is currently the chairman. So I'd be very happy to hear from you. But in the meantime, if there's any questions or comments, then I look forward to hearing and or seeing them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that excellent presentation. It's fascinating looking at the principles there and the problems you've got with getting them into industry. It's very much a case that I think we in ergonomics have had for years, is trying to get people to understand that ergonomics can in fact not only protect the health and safety of your workforce, but it can actually also be of benefit to the company. And that's exactly, obviously, what this standard is trying to promote. And yeah, I hope that companies will do more, take it on more, and so forth. I noted, obviously, the quotes that you have from companies were sort of identifying that they actually do something, or they support and they implement certain aspects of that. And I have this sort of nagging fear in the back of my mind that companies might, yes, be sort of quite proud that they're doing this in one of the areas of the 7 principles, but getting them to adopt all of the issues, the total approach to this, seems to me that's going to be very difficult to get that cultural shift within companies, because that's something that they find difficult to embrace. Am I perhaps being too negative?
No, I think you know, it's entirely right to be slightly skeptical about these things. Couple of points. Absolutely, talk about ergonomics. Our problem in ergonomics is historically that we work bottom up, and then you get to a point where people say, "I'm sorry, we haven't got the budget, we haven't thought about it, we're too busy doing other things. Stop." And so the principle here is to try and get into that whole process from the top down, where you start with engaging the people who can make the decisions, and then you worry about the practicalities later when the poor sods below them have to try and implement it. So that was quite deliberate. And it's also why we didn't call it an ergonomic standard. It says human-centered. If we said ergonomics, I'm afraid, not just thanks to people like Posturite, but we'd have immediately had people thinking we're talking about chairs or whatever, sadly, rather than the bigger picture. But the other thing is, yes, getting companies to do it. I know a number of companies would like to be able to say, can we certify to this standard? And at the moment, you can't. There's two reasons for that. No, there's really one reason. We would never have got it approved internationally if we started out to say we want this to be a standard you certify to. It's a bit like the human-centered design process. When we started out, we said these are just recommendations. After 10 years and nobody had argued that the recommendations weren't good, we then said, right, they're not recommendations, they're requirements. If you want to follow a human-centered design process, this is what you have to do. And I'm hoping that in the fullness of time, once this standard's been out there and widely accepted and a bit more promoted, etc., people will say, hang on a minute, why don't we just make it a standard where you can tick, tick, tick. There's a checklist of the kind of things you need to be able to do, provide evidence along similar to a quality assessment process and say, yes, we are a human-centered organization. And I think that would be great, and I think it would motivate people. But in the international standards field, we would never have got there. We managed to get we had about 20 odd countries involved, and in the final text we only actually had one negative vote out of those 20 countries, and a very diverse range of countries from India and the States and Japan and the UK and Europe, etc. So I think had we said from the beginning we wanted it to be a certification standard, we'd have come up against an awful lot more problems.
Yes, yeah. And then, as you mentioned, there's the other side of it, where it is certified, then it can be measured in the sense of whether or not you do or do not comply. And certainly we find with some of the ergonomic standards that you mentioned earlier, the 9241 and so forth, we find that it's going into companies, and if they can say, well, yes, we follow this standard, then they protect themselves sometimes from litigation or prosecution by a health and safety executive and so forth. So there are the benefits, but I totally appreciate that there are difficulties in getting it to that stage.
I think even a standard that hasn't got requirements, though, people can still claim to follow the principles. The only difficulty with that is that there isn't then an agreed external benchmark that you can monitor it against. But if somebody says, we believe we do implement all these principles, and then, you know, in the jargon that we've been using in the standards, you could say to them, well, prove it, and they would say, here is our evidence. This is why we believe we meet all these recommendations. And standards are never compulsory. They're always an option rather than a compulsion. So in a negotiation, in a trade situation, the client can say, we would like you to be a human-centered organization. Can you prove you are? And the supplier would say, yes, we can. Here's what we've been doing. We've got these programs. We train these people. This is our procedure for so-and-so. And, you know, those two parties can then agree that meets the spirit of the standard. It doesn't need to be a formal checklist box-ticking exercise.
Oh, I think there's a lot of work that can now be done to try and gather the evidence, if you like, as to how much benefit complying or going along these lines can have for a company. And that would encourage others to follow suit. I don't know if there's any plans to try and do that sort of data gathering of positive or companies already involved with this.
Not on an official level. I mean, the standards process doesn't quite work that way. I mean, we're always keen to get feedback on how the standards are working, but they are built on a very slow international consensus process. So once they're there, we don't tend to review them for a period of about 5 years. So that would be the time to make changes based on feedback. But I know the Institute has been interested in promoting the standard and in trying to encourage people to talk about the benefits. And I think it's fairly clear that if you don't do a lot of these things, you're going to have problems. What's less clear is, can you quantify the benefits you'll get out of doing it? And of course, it's like a lot of these things. There's never just one thing that changes. When an organization sets out to do these things, a whole range of factors change. And you know, you're never really comparing like with like. So that's why my view is it's about getting the hearts and minds of senior people to say, yes, this makes sense to me. Because I've had too many senior people in the past when I've talked about doing some very sensible ergonomics improvements say, oh, can you prove it's going to work? Can you show me someone else who's done the same thing? And sometimes you can, but I actually say to them, really, you make all your business decisions based on what other people do? You only do it if somebody else has done it first? And of course they don't, because what they're actually saying is, I don't believe that this is important. I don't believe you. And I'm hoping that we can engage them at this level and say, no, look, this is what you want to do. Here's how you can behave like that.
And I guess that is right, and most companies would accept that. But I do also understand that everybody likes to have that sort of comfort, that mattress to fall on, of knowing that other people have gone this route.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's called the lemming syndrome, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think that's a bit harsh. But
probably a bit harsh, but safety numbers. Yeah.
Before, because we are getting through the time, can I just try? I've got a question here. We can often get the hearts and minds of senior team and also the colleagues. Do you have any tips for getting to the middle managers? Yes, the middle. Yeah.
I think it's important that some middle managers are better than others, and in fact, I think middle management training is actually fairly fundamental to this, because a lot of people rise up into management and are suddenly thrust into a role without any training. And I know the National Institute of Clinical Excellence has recently published some guidelines on sort of middle management training to make managers better at looking after the health of their workforce. So I think recognizing that middle management is tricky, and not just allowing people to bubble up there and be thrown into the role, is very important. I think a lot of it to me boils down to what I was talking about, the kind of mixed messages. On the one hand, they're being told to be nice and friendly and conciliatory, blah blah blah. But by the way, you've got the sickness absence problem, or this has to be out by Friday. And it's a complete mixed message they're getting. And the reality is that bosses can measure time and money. They're not as good at measuring good. So if somebody spends too much money or takes too long, that's a big red flag. If somebody takes a little bit longer and spends a little bit more money and does it better, a lot of systems don't have the metrics to do with that. They can't say, yes, it was worth taking a little bit longer, it was worth spending a bit more money, because the final system is so much better. But that, and so trying to feed that back into to companies, I think, is very important.
Indeed, but I suppose the problem is it only shows over time, doesn't it? With gradual
absolutely. And we've had the well publicized failures in the financial sector, where people were measured sort of within weeks and months, and then the impact's been years, and the poor old public's had to pick up the bits. Lots of these people were being rewarded for outrageous behaviour, which in the very short term paid off. So I mean, I remember we talked about, I was in a working group looking at why big systems fail, and one of the sort of recommendations was that big IT projects, particularly in government, the project manager should be the system manager, the kind of the implemented system manager for like a year after the system's implemented. Not only do they know all about how the system works, but of course they've got a vested interest in making sure that they're not creating problems for themselves. It doesn't always work, but I thought it was an interesting concept that if they were designing something they weren't going to have to run, they would approach it rather differently.
I'm sure you're right. Perhaps Tom, if I may, one final point that's been raised, which I think is interesting, is really what you've been conveying. But it said that our focus tends to be on musculoskeletal problems that we face, and really what we should be doing is understanding and using the benefits of ergonomics, which is what, without calling it without calling it ergonomics, this standard on human well-being and so forth is exactly what we should be doing. And I applaud you and your colleagues in the committees that have brought this forward and got it published. And what we now have to do is get companies to appoint their champions and move ahead, because I think it's exactly the way forward we should be going. So if I can just thank you, Tom, once again for your time and that presentation, and thank everybody else for taking the time to listen. I would at this point normally put in a plug for the next month's webinar, but the speaker hasn't confirmed yet his availability or her availability. I'm not sure who it is. So really, all that remains now is for me to thank everybody for tuning in. Thank you again, Tom, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you.